Research was on Dungeons & Dragons and Social Competence by me, Brendan Galbraith. Before we get too in-depth, there are two main topics we have to get to in this introduction. The first is Dungeons & Dragons. D&D is a specific role-playing tabletop game. In it, you're either a player or the game master. The players create characters for the world run by the game master, and it is powered through one's imagination. The game is a highly interactive one, with your ability to talk to others being a major aspect of the game. You may be wondering, why do research on a tabletop game which probably doesn't affect that many people? That statement, however, is false, as an estimated 50 million people have played D&D in the past, with approximately 13.7 million playing it currently, and that number includes me. For me, this was an important topic because of the impact it has had on me as a person. It allowed me to connect closer with my older brother, who's 12 years older than me, and introduced me to the game, and it also gives me a closer connection with my friends, because I play with them every day at lunch. So this was a really important topic to me, and it's a really important topic for a lot of other people, seen by how many people play it, and also because of how many people play it, even if you don't yourself, you likely interact with people who have, and because it's a super social game, it will impact their social ability, so you will feel it. So this is an important topic. Along with that, the next part of my introduction is social competence, which is the lens that I'm looking at social ability through. This is the whole of one's ability to be a social person. The way that this study and others categorize this is through a tri-component model with three different parts building to the whole, which is the pyramid. Each part builds on top of the other. The first is social skills, which is the skills used in social situations. The next level is social performance, which is how well people actually use those social skills. And the final is social adjustment, or an individual's attainment of their social goals. This sounds all well and good, right? There's a unified way to think about social competence, and Dungeons & Dragons is a social game. What's the problem with this? Well, because of how massive the game is and how important social interaction is within it, Dungeons & Dragons has a large impact on people's social abilities, for better or worse. Along with that, there are many negative stereotypes, which I'll get into later, which persist about the game and have made people see the game in a light that is negative for social ability and should be analyzed more closely to find their validity. This brings us to my question. What impact does playing Dungeons & Dragons have on a high schooler's social competence? The first part of my literature review focuses on the stereotypes that come with D&D. Most of these originate with a group called BAD, or Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, from the 1980s. They were a group that was focused on Dungeons & Dragons. They were very negative towards the game and spread stereotypes about it, such as it promoting devil worship, and also being an isolating experience which disconnects you from your community. From that came other stereotypes built upon their structure, including it being a nerdy and weird game that makes it hard for you to talk to other people in a meaningful way. There have been a lot of studies that have looked into these stereotypes, both from around when the group collapsed after the Satanic Panic ended, all the way until more recently, and most of these have found the stereotypes to be overblown or inaccurate. For the isolating part specifically, they found the exact opposite, where instead of destroying community, it actually builds it up, which brings me perfectly into my next part of my literature review, the previously found benefits. There's a lot of studies that go into the benefits of Dungeons & Dragons, so we would be here all day if I had to mention all of them, so I'm just going to focus on the main ones, which include creativity and self-efficacy, helping people with different disorders like autism or schizoid better connect with people and grow friendships because of the structure the game brings, empathy and concern for others. It also has a similar hope to other social experiences, such as the MMORPG game EverQuest Online Adventures from the early 2000s, where there's a study that focused on that and found that because it was advantageous to work with other people, people's social abilities improved because it helped you in the game, so you had to do it, which helps them in real life as well. This is the same in D&D, since the game becomes easier if you work with your group instead of being antagonistic, and would also be a pattern that follows in other similar games like World of Warcraft, stuff like that. And finally, while these studies' findings were very universal, very similar findings, they focus on the age range of college students or children under the age of 12. While this does combine the studies and makes it so they can confirm each other's findings, this did leave a gap which needs to be covered, which is what I'm doing. My two gaps here, the first one is age. I actually didn't find any studies that were focused on teenagers when it came to Dungeons & Dragons. This is likely because it's more difficult to get permission from minors that it is the readily available college student, and also isn't directly studying early development as it happens with children, so the population was just left out of these studies. Another gap was the idea of social competence as a whole. It wasn't really mentioned by anyone who studied the game, and so this is a new lens to look at D&D's assistance with social ability. So what's my methodology? I did a mixed method as a combination of both qualitative information and quantitative to get as wide of a viewpoint as possible. This is useful to find people's own opinions on their social ability and has been used in many similar sources. Because people are self-reporting, there is the possibility of exaggeration with a survey on how social they are, but the next part of my methodology alleviates the problems that come with it. As mentioned, my first part is a survey. This was used in pretty much all of the ones I based my study off of. It's split into 3 different categories, the 3 aspects of social competence, and the questions were on a Likert scale from 1 to 5, 1 being they're nothing like the question saying, and 5 being like they're exactly like the question. And there were 2 populations for my study. One was people who didn't play Dungeons & Dragons, and one were people who did play Dungeons & Dragons. The next aspect was semi-structured interviews. As with the survey, this was a very common strategy on other studies, which is why I'm emulating it here. This was only a small portion of the total who played Dungeons & Dragons, as I had to select a specific answer to sign up for it. This was mostly used to confirm what the numbers in the survey were saying and to hear people's more in-depth opinion on things. And it also does alleviate the lying that could happen with surveys, because I think it's harder to lie to someone directly to their face than it is through an online survey. And my total population was 70. Of that 70, 43 people did not play Dungeons & Dragons. The other 27 selected that they did play. Now let's get into my results. There's a lot here, so I'm going to try to keep it simple. For the social adjustment aspect, the average score out of 5 for the people who didn't play Dungeons & Dragons was 3.61, whereas for D&D it was 3.43. This is the start of a pattern that you will notice for the rest of the results. For social performance, both scores took a dramatic dive here. For the people who didn't play Dungeons & Dragons, it fell to a 3.1, whereas for people who did play, it fell to a 2.63. Then, for social skills, the scores went up a little bit, with the without D&D going up to a 3.18, people who do play going up to a 2.97. And then, the total average scores for people who didn't play was a 3.29, whereas for people who did play was a 3.01. Now, the interviews and miscellaneous information that didn't fit into the graphs. From the interviews, it appeared as though people were very hesitant to believe possible benefits that would come from Dungeons & Dragons. When asked to give themselves a score out of 5, everyone said a score of 3, even though in the actual data, they got higher than that. When asked what benefits might come from D&D, the most common answer was that talking in large groups was made easier from playing the game, but not much else. That was pretty much the only thing brought up. Along with that, the time that they had been playing the game actually had little effect on the overall scores, with the average staying the same throughout. This might just be because I didn't get a very unique amount of responses for each group. I asked them a question on how long you've been playing the game, and the most common response was 3 years or longer. In fact, the majority of people were that, so I wasn't really able to compare that information. Also, just an interesting thing to note is that there was a universal dip with social performance, with both groups falling dramatically there. This is also an example of one of the questions I had for social adjustment, just to like show you what it's like in the 1 to 5 scale that would show up. So, my discussion. From the results, we found that Dungeons & Dragons scores were generally lower than the general population. This breaks with other studies' findings, since all the ones I checked found that it was a positive. From a combination of my results and the results of others, here are the possible reasons for this anomaly. I have 2 main options, one that I think is more likely than the other. I'll start with the least likely. The first is that Dungeons & Dragons harmed social ability. Because all of the sources I found refute this, I do not believe this is correct, even though my data would make it appear so. This is because of some previous findings within my literature review. I think the more likely answer is the belief in the stereotypes that were mentioned during my lit review. While this might not at first make sense, certain pieces of information seem to make this more likely. As this was a self-reporting survey, the answers that people chose may not be the actual truth, but instead what they believe to be the truth. Couple that with the fact that bothered about Dungeons & Dragons stereotypes still exist today, and you can make the logical connection that people believe that the game is harmful due to what they would have been told in media and by others. I actually hear people in my own group talking about the stereotypes about Dungeons & Dragons and like how it makes you unsocial, even though their scores were not that low. They just didn't believe that their scores would be high. because they believed in the stereotypes. And this information was corroborated by my interviews. Most people were hesitant to trust the benefits from social games, which is shown to be connected. It also feels like the most logical conclusion that playing games that are social will help you grow your social ability. However, people did not trust this, and this gives credence to the idea that there's already some sort of held belief that Dungeons & Dragons is a negative force on people. With the belief in the idea that Dungeons & Dragons does not help, it means that the game's possible benefits are not understood. Along with that, it shows that the belief in stereotypes has an impact on self-perception if the stereotype relates to you, and makes people miss out on the positives. It also shows that the bad, though they may have fallen apart in the late 80s, still has an impact on many people's minds, and shows that the stereotypes for D&D still exist today despite the information showing otherwise. However, there was one major limitation when it came to my study that I felt important to mention, and that was the population size. I was only able to get 70 people total, people for this study, which was frankly less than I wanted. While some might think that this would make the information invalid or inaccurate, I think that thanks to the interviews that I did and the amount of questions I asked within the survey, that most of the negatives from the population size was mitigated. Of course, it would have been better to get more people, but you don't always get what you want. So it did I did the best with what I had. Ugh. To conclude this presentation, I would like to briefly summarize the findings and what future research could go on to. My findings differed from what previous studies found. This was likely because it was self-reported and there was an underlying belief that the game would not have a positive effect, showing that the stereotypes exist until today. To continue on the research, it would be beneficial to hone in deeper into the connections with stereotypes. To do this, there should be more of a focus on this aspect to make a stronger connection. For example, adding more specific questions about this in the semi-structured interview instead of it just coming up organically, so like have some written down already, and also adding more of this into the survey itself by asking questions at the end of it. Finally, it would be useful to compare it to different age demographics, just to see if the same findings occur with non-teenagers or if it's something that is just found within this age range.